Oh, look at this. We are on episode 1 of 8 of the Apollo series. This episode is called Fire on the Pad, which is the story of Apollo 1. And This is Time Tellers, by the way.
Yes.
I'm Renee, and that's Dan. I did a whole intro and everything.
That was not scripted.
No, it was unscripted. Off the cuff. Just,
Does that mean we're going to have to do another corrections episode?
What, you're not Dan and I'm not Renee?
No, this is an AI episode.
It is not. We are real people. I promise. At least some days.
Yeah, some episodes not. We'll let you figure out which ones those were.
And we are always real people. I have no idea what you were talking about.
January 27th, 1967, Cape Kennedy, Florida. It's late afternoon and the sun is going down over the Atlantic. The air is warm. The kind of Florida evening where the light goes golden and everything looks almost too beautiful to be real.
But is it real?
I don't know. On Launch Pad 34, sitting on top of a Saturn 1B rocket, is a spacecraft called Apollo 1. Inside it, wearing full pressure suits and hooked up to oxygen lines, are 3 men. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. They've been in there for hours already. They're not going anywhere today. This is a ground test, a simulated countdown, what NASA called a plugs-out test. No rocket fuel, no ignition. The goal is simply to run through every system, every checklist, and make sure everything works before the real launch scheduled for February 21st, less than 4 weeks away.
Ooh, that's not very long away.
No. Grissom had been annoyed all afternoon. The comm system keeps cutting out, a persistent static that makes communication between the capsule and the ground almost impossible. He's been snapping at the ground crew. At one point he holds up a lemon, an actual lemon brought exactly for this purpose, and asks a technician to photograph it next to the capsule. His way of saying, on the record, without saying it directly, this thing is a lemon.
Was that a term we used back then, or is that a more modern
Obviously
term?
It was.
Did he really actually?
Yes.
Okay, I believe you. I didn't think that.
Yeah, that whole lemon thing goes back to when cars started being sold.
Okay.
In every kind of vehicle.
Fair.
Privately, Grissom has been saying something more alarming. In the weeks before this test, he told his wife Betty and several colleagues that he had serious doubts about whether Apollo 1 was ready. Not a feeling, not nerves, a specific informed professional judgment from the most experienced astronaut in the program.
Oh no, that is such a bad, very bad, no good omen. I don't like this story already.
It doesn't get better, Renee.
Of course not. I know. I do know this story, and I know it doesn't get better.
At 6:31 p.m., the count has stopped. The comm problems have made the test essentially impossible to run properly. Grissom is on the radio, frustrated, saying something about how they can't expect to fly if they can't talk between 2 buildings, let alone to the moon.
Fair point.
Yeah. And then one of the astronauts, the investigation was never able to conclusively determine which one, says something over the comm. The transcripts are garbled, but it sounds like the word fire.
Okay.
No. 8 seconds later, a second voice, also unidentified, says, "We've got a fire in the cockpit."
Oh, got a fire in the cockpit.
14 seconds after that, the capsule ruptures from the internal pressure of the fire. The hatch, which opens inward and requires 90 seconds and 2 people to open under the best conditions, is impossible to open against the force of a fire burning at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. All 3 men are gone within seconds. The entire fire, from first report to rupture, lasts less than 30 seconds.
Jesus.
Pad technicians reach the hatch 5 minutes later. The scene inside is devastating. They cannot identify the crew members by sight.
I mean, that is... Okay, fire is devastating. And on the ground as well. They didn't even get the chance to launch.
On the ground on a Friday evening in front of the launch crew, who could hear it happen and couldn't do a single thing to help them.
Welcome to Time Tellers. I'm Renee.
And I'm Dan, and today we're telling the whole story of Apollo 1. Not just the fire, but who these men were, how it happened, why it should never have happened, and why the worst day in NASA's history might also be the reason Apollo 11 succeeded 2.5 years later.
That is a heavy promise for a Friday.
It's a heavy story, but it's an important one, and I promise it doesn't end in despair. These men deserve to be more than a tragedy. They deserve the whole story.
Okay, let's go.
Before we talk about what happened, I want to talk about who was in that capsule.
Good idea.
Because I think there's a tendency, especially 50-something years later, for these names to become abstract. Symbols of sacrifice rather than actual human beings with histories and families and peculiarities and flaws. So let's spend some time with them.
Okay, start with Grissom, because I feel like a lot of people know that name, but couldn't necessarily tell you anything specific about him.
Virgil Ivan Grissom goes by Gus, born in Mitchell, Indiana in 1926. Son of a railroad worker, the oldest of 4 kids, small town working class, the kind of American background that never gets described as glamorous, but produces a disproportionate number of people who end up doing extraordinary things simply because they're used to working hard and don't know they're supposed to think small. He flew 100 combat missions in Korea, came home and became a test pilot at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Ooh, Dayton, Ohio.
And aliens. Which at the time was basically the world capital of experimental aviation. He was selected as one of the original Mercury 7 in 1959, the first class of American astronauts, chosen from over 500 military pilot candidates. Grissom made the cut. Most people didn't.
That would be a hard cut to make.
Yeah. But in 1967, Gus Grissom was arguably the most experienced astronaut NASA had. He'd flown Liberty Bell 7 and the Mercury program in 1961, only the second American in space. He'd commanded the first Gemini mission, Gemini 3, in 1965, alongside John Young. He was the presumptive commander of the first moon landing. If you'd ask a NASA insider in 1966, who was most likely to be the first human to walk on the moon, a lot of them would have said Gus Grissom.
Wait, so he wasn't just important, he was the guy, the it guy. He was the guy who was supposed to be first.
He was very much the guy. Short, about 5'7", stocky, from Mitchell, Indiana, not flashy like some of the others. John Glenn was the golden boy, Alan Shepard had the cool aristocratic thing going on. Scar Carpenter was the poet-philosopher of the group. Grissom was just a worker. Exceptionally competent, methodical, professionally unflappable, the kind of person other pilots trusted with their lives, without having to think about it. Privately, he was funny, he had a dry, sardonic sense of humor, but publicly he was gruff and often impatient with anything he considered a waste of time.
Fair.
He had one piece of baggage that followed him throughout his career. On his Mercury flight in 1961, after splashdown, the hatch of his capsule blew open prematurely and the capsule sank in the Atlantic. Grissom barely made it out. He always insisted it wasn't his fault, that something had malfunctioned, that he hadn't touched the explosive hatch bolt. The Navy divers, focused on saving the capsule, almost let him drown in the process. NASA ultimately cleared him and put him back on flight status, but for years there was a whisper in certain corners that he'd panicked, that he'd blown the hatch himself, and that it had been pilot error. It haunted him. He was obsessive about it in a way that the people closest to him recognized as more than professional pride. It was something he needed to have put right.
That is such a devastating irony. He spent his career being associated with a hatch that opened when it shouldn't have, and then he died because a hatch wouldn't open when it should have.
History doesn't do its cruelty subtly. Ed White was the second man in the capsule. Edward Higgin White's the second. Son of a general, grandson of a pilot, he was in many ways everything the American space program wanted to put on in front of a camera. Handsome, physically extraordinary, genuinely warm. He became the first American to walk in space on the Gemini 4 mission in June 1965. He floated outside the capsule for 23 minutes with a small handheld jet gun maneuvering through space. When Mission Control told him it was time to come back in, he refused for a while.
He's like a dog in the backyard. He won't come back in when you call him.
He said on a hot mic that went to the ground.
Smeared up my windshield, you dirty dog. Yeah. See how it's all smeared up there? Yeah. It looks like there's a coating on the outside, and you've rubbed it off. That's exactly what you've done.
Gemini 4, Houston Capcom. Gemini 4, Houston Capcom.
You know, the spacecraft rates are up about 1 degree per second. It's pitching you on about 0.5 degree per second in roll. I'm not that bad at the pictures that I've got yet. Okay.
I can't guess. Houston Capcom.
Third, I don't even know exactly where we are, but it looks like we're about over Texas again.
Jiminy 4, Houston, Capcom.
As a matter of fact, that looks like Houston down below us.
Jiminy 4, Houston, Capcom.
Right? Hey, Gus, I don't know if you're reading, but we're right over Houston. Run out and look.
Jiminy 4? Jiminy 4, Houston?
Yeah, that's Gallows Bay right there. Huh? Hey, Ed, can you see on your side the spacecraft? Can you see the camera here? Yeah. Is it pointing at you? No. Which way? Behind the deck. I can't get the picture. Now, don't get back there where the, I'm not behind it. I might have got my...
Come, release your
Jiminy 4, Houston?
Release your back key.
Jiminy 4, Houston? Jiminy 4, Houston? Jiminy 4, Houston?
But still not that side of the picture target. I've only got about 3 or 4. Is that right? Well, I've taken a lot, but they're not very good. You're in too close for most of them. I finally put the focus down to about 8 feet or so.
Jiminy 4, Houston?
Flight, would you tell
Oh, yeah, that's
Cord
pretty
to release
close
the
to water
water
behind you.
key when you're trying to talk to him? So that I can't do that now, man. He's on box. Roger.
Jiminy 4, Houston? Jiminy 4, Houston?
Right, yes, sir.
Jiminy 4, Houston?
Right.
Ed, this thing about the reference we were talking about looks like it's sure right. Yeah.
Jiminy 4, Houston? Jiminy 4, Houston?
See what flight director's got to say.
The flight director says get back in.
Jim, what? Got any message for us?
Jiminy 4, get back in.
Okay. I don't know. We're coming over to the west end. We want you to come back in now.
Roger, we've been trying to talk to you for a while here.
No, back in. Come on. This is taking almost nothing. We still got 3.5 more days to go, buddy.
That is such a beautiful detail. He just wanted to stay in space forever, float out there, and never come back.
By all accounts, he was the most physically fit person NASA had ever put through its selection process. He ran, he played golf seriously, not casually. He did everything with the kind of focused intensity that made people around him feel simultaneously inspired and slightly exhausted. His spacewalk photograph, this enormous grin floating above the Earth with the blackness of space behind him, became one of the iconic images of the whole program. He was also, according to virtually everyone who knew him, genuinely kind, not performed kindness, not public relations kindness, the real kind. People who worked with him talked about it specifically years later as though it was the thing that he most wanted you to understand about him.
And Roger Chaffee. I feel like he gets the least attention out of the three.
Roger Chaffee, 31 years old on the day of the fire. He was going to be 32 in February. He'd been selected as an astronaut in 1963 as part of the third group, the one the press called the 14. He was a rival aviator, a graduate of Purdue University, sharp and eager, and by all accounts completely well-liked by everyone who worked with him.
Mr. Nice Guy.
This was going to be his first space flight. He'd spent 4 years since his selection doing the unglamorous work of the backup astronaut. Communication support, technical liaison, the kind of work that's essential and invisible. He'd been assigned to Apollo 1 and had been training for it, with the kind of intensity that people who've been waiting a long time bring to things they've finally been given. He was ready. He was more than ready.
However, he never got to fly.
His entire NASA career was preparation for a mission that killed him before it launched. He was 31 years old.
I want to ask something that's been on my mind since you started the cold open. Their families, where were they? Did they know what had happened, and who called them?
Betty Grissom was home in Houston. She found out when a neighbor, not NASA, a neighbor called her to ask if she'd heard the news on the radio. NASA had yet to call her.
That's horrible.
And this is before the internet even.
Right?
Pat White, Ed's wife, was actually at the Cape that day. She'd come down for the test. She was waiting at a party for some of the NASA staff when somebody came in with the news. She was told by a friend before any official notification.
At least it was a friend?
I mean, I'd say assume a neighbor might be a friend, too. But,
that's fair. Fair point.
I mean, they kind of all lived in the same...
They did. That is true. They did.
Yeah. Martha Chaffee was also in Houston. She also learned from a neighbor who had heard it on the news.
None of them were called first. They all found out from other people before NASA, called them and told them the news.
Or even, send somebody over as opposed to just calling them.
Yeah, even like the military, they respond quickly to, as quickly as they can. You get notified from the military, not generally speaking, your next-door neighbor.
There was no protocol. NASA never had to make those calls before. The program had never killed anyone. They were scrambling in every direction at once, securing the site, dealing with the press, managing the investigation, and the families got calls from neighbors listening to the radio before anyone from NASA picked up a phone.
That is beyond enraging. These women's husbands just died in a government facility on a government mission, and they find out from neighbors?
The failure of communication that killed those men extended in a particularly painful way to the people they loved most.
I'm furious on their behalf. Okay, let's talk about how it happened. So I want to try and explain the mechanics of this.
Because you're the science person.
Yeah. No. Because I have been reading about it, and I think it's really important to understand that this was not a random accident. This was the result of specific decisions made by specific people under specific pressures.
Sounds specific.
Yes, it does. That's a lot of specifics. And I'd like to lay that out before Dan does it, because when Dan explains things, there's a risk they may become very technical very quickly, and I'd like everyone at home to follow along.
That's fair.
So, the capsule. It used a pure oxygen atmosphere, 100% oxygen at slightly higher than sea level pressure, about 16.7 pounds per square inch, where sea level is about 14.7. They use this because it massively simplifies the life support system. You don't have to mix gases. You don't have to worry about nitrogen narcosis at altitude. The whole thing becomes much more manageable. Mercury had used it. Gemini had used it. Nobody had died.
In the vacuum of space, pure oxygen at low pressure, about 5 pounds per square inch, is manageable. The risk goes up dramatically at ground level pressure, which is what the plugs out test was running.
Right. And here's the thing I want to linger on, because I think this is where the real horror lives. In pure oxygen at elevated pressure, almost everything becomes fuel. Things that don't normally burn. Velcro burns, foam burns, nylon burns. Even some metals will ignite and burn in pure oxygen at pressure. And the interior of Apollo 1 was absolutely packed with all of those things.
The post-fire investigation found approximately 70 pounds of combustible material in the cabin, including roughly 34 miles of wire.
That's a lot of mileage. 34 miles of wire inside a spacecraft that is smaller than a modern SUV. And in pure oxygen at pressure, any single spark from any single piece of that wire is a potential catastrophe. And there had been sparks. There had been reports. For months before the fire, engineers working on the spacecraft had flagged wiring problems, chafed insulation, poor routing, connections that didn't meet spec. These were logged, officially logged, and the program kept moving on.
The most likely ignition point, according to the investigation, was a bundle of wiring routed underneath and behind Grissom's seat, in an area near the environmental control unit. The wiring passed through a small gap at the edge of the hatch, a spot where the hatch opening and closing over many months had repeatedly abraded the insulation. At some point, a spark jumped in pure oxygen at 16 plus pounds per square inch. That spark was enough.
And once it started, it was over almost instantly.
14 seconds from first report to rupture. The fire grew so fast that the internal pressure exceeded the structural strength of the hull. The cabin essentially exploded outward. The hatch, even if someone had been standing by to open it, couldn't have been opened in 14 seconds under any circumstances.
So why did they keep going? That's what I keep coming back to. Grissom had been complaining for months. Reports were being filed and ignored. People knew there were problems, and the program just kept going.
The pressure, and I mean this both literally and figuratively, was immense. Kennedy had made his promise in 1961 before this decade is out. That was the mandate. In 1967, the decade had 3 years left, and the program was already behind schedule. North American Aviation, the prime contractor building the spacecraft, had its own schedule pressures and financial incentives tied to delivery dates.
So nobody wanted to be the person who said stop. wait a minute.
The culture at the time was not one that rewarded caution. Thomas Barron, a quality control inspector at North American Aviation, filed a comprehensive report before the fire documenting hundreds of problems he'd seen during the manufacturing process. The report was hundreds of pages long. He was fired. He died in a car accident a few months after the fire before he could just testify fully to Congress.
He filed the report, got fired, and then died before he could testify. That sentence should make everyone uncomfortable.
It should, and there were others. Engineers inside NASA and at North American who had concerns they felt unable to escalate. Not because the concerns weren't valid, because the culture said, keep moving, we're behind, we'll fix it later.
And later never came for Grissom, White, and Chaffee.
The congressional investigation was scathing. Post-fire review board was scathing. The phrase they used repeatedly was a failure of communication between contractors and NASA, between engineers and management, between the people who knew there were problems and the people who needed to decide what to do about them.
This is the part where I want to say something that might be uncomfortable. This wasn't an accident. An accident is something that happens despite everyone doing everything right. This was a system failure. People made choices made under pressure, choices made with incomplete information, choices made because the alternative was slowing down, and 3 men died because of those choices.
That's exactly right. And the distinction matters, because calling it an accident implies it couldn't have been prevented. It could have been. Multiple points in the chain of events leading to January 27th could have been interrupted. That doesn't mean any individual person is a murderer, but it means the system failed and systems are made of choices.
Disasters happen to you. Tragedies are made.
Where do you come up with these?
English teacher. I've been workshopping that one.
That was good.
My delivery or the line?
The line I wrote for you to say? I want to spend a few minutes on what we actually know about those final 14 seconds, because I think it's important and because the crew deserves to have the record reflect what actually happened in there.
Okay.
First, they knew immediately. The first transmission, fire, came within moments of ignition. They were aware. They were not caught unaware in their sleep or distracted by something else. They knew. Second, they tried to get out. The investigation found evidence that at least one crew member had attempted to open the hatch. The inner hatch mechanism had been partially operated. They tried. They did everything they could do in the time they had, which was not enough time.
They tried.
Third, the medical examiner's report, which is deeply unpleasant to read, concluded that the men died of cardiac arrest caused by smoke inhalation, meaning they lost consciousness before the worst of the fire had reached them. They did not burn to death. I want to be clear about that because it matters for their dignity and for their families.
Okay, thank you for saying that.
We try to be informative. The investigation took months. The review board examined over 3,000 pounds of hardware. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, they ran tests and simulations, and their conclusions was essentially that the fire was a result of an accumulation of deficiencies in design, manufacturing, and management and testing philosophy that they had built up over the years, and it finally became lethal.
And NASA took responsibility.
Flight Director Gene Kranz, who was not on duty that day, but who became one of the most important figures in what came next, went to his team 2 days after the fire and delivered a speech that has since become one of the defining documents of mission control culture. He said, from this day forward, flight control will be known by 2 words, tough and competent. Tough means we are forever accountable for what we do or what we fail to do. Competent means we will never take anything for granted. He then said spaceflight will never tolerate carelessness, incapacity, and neglect. Somewhere, somehow, we screwed up. It could have been in design, build, or test. Whatever it was, we should have caught it. We were too gung-ho about the schedule, and we looked at all the problems we saw each day in our work. Every one of us is guilty.
He said that to his own team 2 days after 3 astronauts died.
Gene Kranz did not go looking for someone else to blame. He stood up in front of his team and said, we failed and we will not fail again. Whether or not you think NASA bore the ultimate responsibility for the fire, and I think you can make a strong argument that the contractor culture and political pressure deserves more of the blame than NASA's internal culture, Kranz's response in those days afterwards was one of the most important things that happened in the whole Apollo program.
Because it set the tone for how the program was going to function going forward.
Exactly. Not just grief to blame and finger-pointing, accountability, and then work. After the fire, NASA grounded all crewed missions. No one flew for 20 months. And in that time, they did something remarkable. They rebuilt the program.
Not just the capsule.
Not just the capsule. The capsule was redesigned from essentially the ground up. New hatch, new materials, new atmosphere protocols, new wiring standards. But the culture was also being rebuilt. The way problems were reported, the way concerns were escalated, the relationship between NASA management and the contractors. All of it went under examination.
Tell me about the physical changes, the capsule specifically.
3 main categories. First, the atmosphere. For ground testing, they switched from pure oxygen to a mixed nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere at normal pressure. Much harder to ignite, much safer if something sparks. In space, they maintained the pure oxygen system at low pressure, where it's significantly less dangerous. It was a compromise. Some engineers wanted to switch to mixed gas entirely, but it dramatically reduced the risk of a ground fire. Second, the hatch. The original hatch required 2 people and roughly 90 seconds to open, and it opened inward, meaning internal pressure held it shut. The new hatch was a unified quick opening design that one person could open in under 10 seconds, and it opened outward, so internal pressure didn't work against it. The new hatch went through hundreds of tests. One person, 10 seconds alone in the dark in a pressure suit.
That's... Honestly, I can't believe the original design was approved. What was the thinking behind that?
The inward opening hatch was itself an overcorrection. After Grissom's Mercury capsule sank in 1961, the incident with the hatch blowing open, NASA became very worried about explosive hatches opening accidentally in space. So they designed one that was much harder to open unintentionally. In doing so, they created one that was impossible to open in an emergency.
They solved the problem of hatches that open when they shouldn't by creating hatches that don't open when they should. Great.
That is precisely the engineering tragedy at the heart of it. In the third category, materials. Investigation found approximately 70 pounds of combustible material in the original cabin. The redesigned cabin used fire-resistant materials whenever possible. Velcro was replaced or significantly reduced. Wiring was rerouted, insulated, inspected with a new level of rigor, and the new capsule had roughly a third of the flammable content of the original.
And it worked. The redesigned worked.
It worked. The hatch redesign in particular proved its value in a way nobody wanted to have proved. When Apollo 13 had his accident in 1970 and the crew needed to move quickly between the command module and the lunar module, in an emergency in a crippled spacecraft, they could do it. The hatches opened in seconds. That's a direct line from the deaths of Grissom, White, and Chaffee to the survival of Lover, Swaggart, and Hayes. It's terrible, it's true.
The fire that killed 3 men led directly to a design that saved 3 others.
Which you'll be hearing about in 4 episodes from now, maybe 5.
Right.
And that's the thing that makes this story so hard to carry. Something real and good came from something terrible and preventable.
Which so often that's how
Yeah.
it happens.
The fact that good came after doesn't justify the terrible. But it happened, and you have to hold both things.
I want to talk about the families, because I keep coming back to them. Betty Grissom, Pat White, Martha Chaffee. What happened to them? How did they navigate what came after? How could you ever?
Betty Grissom was remarkably direct in her response. She sued North American Aviation, the prime contractor, for negligence, settled out of court. The amount was reportedly around $350,000, which in 1969 dollars was meaningful, but not enormous for the death of the most experienced astronaut in the program. She was one of the first astronaut widows to take legal action, and NASA's institutional culture at the time found it deeply uncomfortable. The unspoken expectation was that astronaut families would grieve quietly and publicly support the program. Betty Grissom did not do that.
Good for her.
Pat White, Ed's wife, had a much harder path. She struggled enormously in the years after the fire. She remarried. She died in 1983. The official cause was listed as suicide, though her family has questioned the circumstances over the years. Her son, Ed White III, graduated from West Point like his father, and has spent much of his adult life working to honor his father's memory and legacy.
What about Martha?
Martha Chaffee raised her 2 children and largely stayed out of the public's eye. Roger's son, Stephen, later said that his father was the forgotten one of the 3, that Grissom was the senior figure, White was the photogenic spacewalker, and Roger was the young one who hadn't yet done anything famous enough to be remembered. Stephen spent years trying to change that.
These families, the people left behind by history-making events who then just have to live their regular lives. I find that so heavy to think about.
It's one of those things that gets overlooked when we talk about the cost of the space program. The direct cost is 12 lives. 3 on Apollo 1, 7 on Challenger, 7 on Columbia. The indirect cost is all the people who love them.
I want to talk about legacy, not just the engineering legacy, which Dan has covered thoroughly, but what Apollo 1 meant for how America understood the space program. Because I think something shifted on January 27th, 1967 that doesn't get talked enough about.
Go ahead.
Before Apollo 1, the astronauts had been presented to the public and had been, to a large extent, received as kind of a secular mythology. These perfect specimens, crew cuts, white teeth, firm handshakes, beautiful wives, wholesome families. These men were not just test pilots, they were symbols. They represented American greatness and technological supremacy and the inevitability of our winning the Cold War. Keep going.
Yeah. The astronaut, as American hero, was one of the defining cultural constructions of the early 1960s.
And then, on a Friday afternoon in January 1967, 3 of them died in a routine ground test. Not in space, not heroically, and erratically maybe, hurtling towards the moon at 17,000 miles per hour. On a launch pad, in front of the support crew, in less than 30 seconds. And I think that broke something in the public understanding of what was actually happening here.
The polls showed a significant drop in public support for the space program in the months after the fire. The congressional investigation was uncomfortable and pointed. There were serious questions about whether it should continue at all.
And here where I want to be careful, because I think there's a narrative that gets told about Apollo 1 that I find slightly dishonest. The narrative is the fire was a terrible tragedy, but it made Apollo 11 possible. Grissom, White, and Chaffee didn't die in vain. And that narrative is not wrong, exactly. The redesign was real, the culture change was real, and the new hatch saved lives. All of that is true. But I don't want it to become a way of tidying up the grief into something useful, of converting loss into lesson and moving on. Because Grissom, White, and Chaffee didn't choose to die for the program, they were killed by a preventable failure. The fact that something good came afterward is not the same as saying it had to happen this way. It didn't have to happen this way. It should not have happened this way.
I think that's exactly right, and I think it's a more honest way to honor them than the they didn't die in vain formulation, which can slip into something almost comfortable if you're not careful.
Okay, I have one last question before we close. It's been on my mind since the beginning. Did Grissom know? He was openly unhappy with this spacecraft. He was filing complaints. He was carrying around literal lemons. Do you think on some level he understood that something might go catastrophically wrong?
There's a quote from him. He gave an interview a few months before he died, not specifically about Apollo 1, just a general interview about the space program and its risks. He said, "If we die, we want people to accept it. We are in a risky business. And we hope that if anything happens to us, it will not delay the program. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life."
He said that.
He said that, whether it was for a specific premonition or just the pragmatism of a man who'd spent his career in experimental aircraft where people died regularly. And you had to make peace with that. I genuinely don't know. But Gus Grissom understood what he'd signed up for. He understood it with a clarity that's almost unbearable to read now.
That doesn't make it any less tragic.
No, it doesn't make it less tragic. It doesn't make it okay. It doesn't justify the shortcuts or the schedule pressure or the wiring that should have been fixed. It just means he was a man who went in with his eyes open, and the program owed him better than it gave him.
Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, January 27th, 1967. They were 37 years old, 36 years old, and 31 years old. They went to work on a Friday afternoon to run a routine test on a spacecraft that they were going to take to the moon. They were not supposed to die that day. In some ways, in the redesigned hatch, in the new atmosphere protocols, in the culture that Gene Kranz built from the ashes of what went wrong, they got something. Something real and lasting came from what happened to them. But they deserved better first. The program owed them better. And I think the least we can do 50-some years later is say that clearly.
There's a memorial at Cape Canaveral at Launch Pad 34. The pad is decommissioned, the gantry is gone, it's just a concrete expanse now with a small plaque. The plaque reads, "They gave their lives in service to their country in the ongoing exploration of humankind's final frontier. Remember them not for how they died, but for those ideals for which they lived."
I'm not crying.
You're a little crying.
Okay, I'm a little crying. Okay, next episode, Apollo 8. Dan promises it's an uplifting story, which I need more now than I can express after this one.
It's uplifting. It happens on Christmas Eve, 1968, and it involves a photograph that might be the most consequential single image in the history of the environmental movement. It's a genuinely beautiful story.
I'll be there. Thanks for listening to Time Tellers, everyone. If this episode moved you, leave us a review. Tell somebody about Roger Chaffee, the youngest of three, the one people often forget. He was 31 years old and he never got to fly. He deserves to be remembered.
Keep asking questions.
And keep looking up. Bye!